or even the PCA. I'm defending mainline
the
Protestant.
Presbyterian Church of America.
Yeah, that's the schismatic conservative group that left in the 1970s because they didn't like that the Presbyterian Church supported civil rights. I know that that's true because they've publicly repented of that, but that's still why they exist.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to break the terms down here because I think I look at Protestantism. I have a different categorical framework. Yours seems to be more institutional based, just to understand who is a Protestant. It seems like your definition is more of a historical institutional continuity versus doctrine or methods.
I mean, basically, yeah.
There it is.
Like, if I am some random guy in my basement and I decide that I agree with transubstantiation and purgatory, does that make me a Catholic? No, I have to actually join the Catholic Church. So I think you're comparing apples and oranges if you compare the institution of Catholicism to the vague idea of Protestantism based on the 5 solas, which didn't exist until the 20th century.
Okay.
I define Protestantism the same way you would define Catholicism or Orthodoxy. It's an institution. A Protestant is someone who's part of a Protestant church, and a Protestant church is a church with roots in the Reformation.
And so even right there, what does it mean to have roots in the Reformation? Does the CREC have roots in the Reformation? I would say absolutely and obviously. But he's going to want to say no because we're a relatively new denomination.
Right. And I would say that, again, can we have the best of both worlds when it can exist? Sure. But if you've got to choose one of them to say herein lies the legitimate Protestant church, the legitimate Christian church for that, the legitimate Catholic church for that, you got to go with doctrine, you got to go with theology, you have to go with morals, you have to go with ethics, because we really are talking about the question of whether or not an institution can go apostate.
Right.
Is it just individuals who go apostate, or can an institution go apostate?
Hello and welcome to the Reformation Red Pill podcast, brought to you by the Forge Press and now a part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. I am your host, Joshua Haymes, and well, you can already guess by now what kind of episode, the type of episode. We only bring you special episodes. So we've got a very, very special episode today. Today, we are going to be reacting to, responding to, giving an analysis of a clip from this interview between Redeemed Zoomer, who I personally like. We've had him on the show, and he is a Presbyterian PCUSA guy who is all about trying to retake the mainline denominations. And so he had an interview with Trent Horn, who's a Catholic apologist. And this was just a few days ago. And they got into a bunch of different areas, a bunch of different theological issues. But for our purposes today, we're going to be responding to a particular section of the interview, namely where Redeemed Zoomer claims that evangelicals are not real Protestants. He wants to have a taxonomy that basically divides the Christian world into Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, and evangelicals. He does not want Protestants and evangelicals to be thought of as the same thing. And so we're going to be reacting to that, responding to that, giving an analysis of the interview. He gets into a lot more than just that in this section, but that's the question that catalyzed this particular kind of response video. And I have the pleasure of bringing in a returning guest. Oh man, I can hear the crowd. They are just so excited to hear Pastor Paul Liberati. For anyone who might just now be tuning in and who hasn't caught you on our previous episodes, can you just give a quick introduction? Who are you, Pastor Paul? What do you do? And how can people find you and your work?
So Paul Liberati, I am the senior pastor of Church of the King, Sacramento. We are a member congregation of the CREC, and you can get us online, churchofthekingsacramento.org. If you go on Facebook, I'm not much of a Twitter guy. I think I need to get on Twitter or X. I apologize.
Twitter is now saying Twitter is left coded, so we have to say X as conservatives.
I'm sorry. Yeah. See, I need to get up on that. So if they really want to see what we do here as a congregation and the ministry that the Lord has given us here in Sacramento, California, churchofthekingsacramento.org is the best place to do that. And if you want to check anything online, I do have an old blog that I'm sort of revamping. It's paullliberati.com, but Paul Liberati with one L between Paul and Liberati. They share an L, paullliberati.com. And I have some articles that I post up there from time to time.
You guys should really follow along with what Pastor Paul is doing. He is brilliant, as you've already seen in many episodes that he's already been on. Super, super sharp. I have a ton of respect for you, Pastor Paul. And like I said before, you're one of the very first pastors I met in the CREC, and it was such a warm welcome to meet you first, and that was just so delightful. So not only is he a delightful human being, he's also super sharp. Go check out his work, guys. And he'll be reoccurring guest, so you guys will see a lot of him. So we're going to get into what is Protestantism, who decides what Protestantism is, is Redeemed Zoomer's taxonomy that he tries to outline, is that accurate in any way? And are John MacArthur and William Lane Craig's heretics? We get into some of that in there too. But we're just going to really just respond and play the interview for you. If you want to go back and watch the whole thing, you guys should totally do that. I'll tag that the whole interview in the description of the video. But we're just going to jump in. And before we jump into the interview itself, I want to personally invite you, dear listener, dear viewer, come join our club membership. Okay, I know that stop, don't skip. You're about to skip. Don't do it. Just wait 1 second. Hear me out. We are just now really getting into revamping our Discord and just beefing it up. It's so cool. It's so exciting. We've finally got exclusive content back on the menu. But not only that, we just instituted what we're calling the Castle Grounds, where we are going to be hosting live debates just for our Discord people. So people in our Discord are going to be taking theological issues and debating them. We actually have our first one coming up tomorrow on the topic of onanism, and it's going to be really, really interesting. For those of you who don't know what that is, just go look it up. I'm not going to explain it to you right now, but it's a natural law kind of biblicism debate on the marriage bed in many ways. So anyway, it's really fun, really exciting. Plus, if you join our Knox tier, you get this sweet little Min of Issachar tumbler. Oh, we've only got like 90 left, so it's exclusive. Come on. And we have a fiction book club where we're going over. We're about to start Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, who is a Catholic. Yeah, he's a Catholic author, and that is a cult classic sci-fi. We're also going over another book, The American Story, in our nonfiction book club. So we've got a lot going on. So just if that's not enough to get you, I don't know what is. But if you're not feeling the club membership, just patronize one of our wonderful sponsors. You'll see all the links in the description. And so with that, let's go ahead and transition into this interview.
You call them Protestant schismatic groups. I want to make sure we get all of our terms clear here, because a lot of people, when they think of schism, they think about departing from someone who has legitimate ecclesial magisterial authority. Yeah. Are you talking about people who, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, claim to be like a mainline Protestant denomination, but they're not? They only are in name only? Sort of.
I think voluntary schism is a lot different than forced schism. There's been many schisms in church history, like the Chalcedonians versus the non-Chalcedonians, right, and the Great Schism and the Protestant Reformation. In none of those cases was there one group consciously and willingly and voluntarily departing from the mainstream established group. Nobody committed voluntary schism, really, until the Great Awakenings in America, which is really where evangelicalism is birthed. So I think if you talk about what's generally perceived as Protestantism, you have mainline Protestantism on one end, which has the historical continuity to the Protestant Reformation. On the other end, you have evangelicalism, which is Protestant in name only and has zero continuity to the Reformation. Okay. And then you have schismatic Protestant groups, which are usually conservative, and they try to preserve some of the beliefs of the Reformation more than the mainlines do, right, but they end up adopting an evangelical ecclesiology by rejecting the institutional church.
Okay.
So that's why if you go to like your old historic, beautiful Episcopal cathedral or Presbyterian church or Methodist church, chances are it's a mainline Protestant church. Chances are it's not part of the ACNA or the PCA or the Global Methodist Church, these recent schismatic offshoots.
So let's try to understand a bit. It seemed like your concern when you were saying you were done being a Protestant apologist is that you want to focus on what you call the Reconquista initiative. your claim was essentially, it sounded like, you need, before we reach out to Catholics, before we draw people into Protestantism needs to define itself and needs to clean house, and especially needs to purge these, for lack of a better term, liberal elements within it.
Absolutely.
So you feel the need to do that. How would you reply, playing devil's advocate?
Sure.
Someone says, RZ, why do you care about that? I mean, Catholicism is just as liberal, if not more liberal. Like Pope Francis said, who am I to judge? I mean, people say these things.
Yeah, but they're wrong. Catholicism is objectively a lot less liberalized than the mainline Protestant denominations. And that's because the conservative Catholics weren't cowards and they cared about their own heritage and they didn't run away. And I respect them for that. Whereas a lot of the conservative Protestants in America, this is specifically in American context, because in most other countries, the mainline Protestant church.
Okay, let's pause there and kind of explore this idea that the reason that evangelicals in America fled these institutions was because of cowardice. What do you think about that, Pastor Paul? Because whenever I had Redeemed Zoomer on the show, I kind of pressed him on that as well. I don't think it's fair to say that there was some kind of cowardice or fear. I can't even imagine that, actually. Like, oh, we're so scared, so we're gonna go start another institution that which it will be objectively more difficult to maintain, institutional power and or even influence in the culture and all that kind of stuff, all those things. It's going to be difficult for us. So it doesn't seem like it would be motivated by fear to. I don't even know what we would be afraid of, or what evangelicals would be afraid of in that scenario. What are your thoughts on that, Pastor Paul?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think referring to it as cowardice is a bit too far. I think we have to take each one of these institutional splits on a case-by-case basis. Maybe there were some that just refused to fight, even though they had the majority at the time, but decided that they were going to walk out. Fine. Okay. Going back a little bit, though, this is a very complex topic because we're talking about taxonomy. We're talking about how do you organize the Protestant churches? How do you organize the church as a whole? Now, Roman Catholicism, the Eastern churches, the Protestant churches, and so forth. And I appreciate wanting to take a historical approach to the matter. I appreciate that. But there's a couple of different ways you could do that. One way you could do it is you could do it on an institutional basis. That's what Redeemed Zoomer seems to want to do. He wants to focus on the institutions as being the legitimate churches. And there's another way to do it, and that is on a theological basis. And I think that's more of a magisterial reformer position. Whereas, Luther and Calvin both very much emphasize doctrinal purity and their continuity with the doctrinal teachings of Scripture, and also the doctrinal continuity they had with the early church fathers and so on. So there's two different things. There's two different possibilities here. You could go in either of these directions. Mm-hmm. And it seems that he's really pressing hard on the institutional aspect of this, and so I would want to hear more about that as he develops it, perhaps, or defends why he's making that. The other one is the one you're bringing up here. Notice how he said, there's a difference between voluntary and involuntary departure. I think that's fair. That's what he said, and he's not faulting those who were forced to leave the historic institutions, but instead he's faulting those who voluntarily of their own will left. This seems to, again, it's consistent if he's taking an institutional approach. That's fine. I understand he's trying to be consistent. But if you can argue for a theological emphasis here and a doctrinal emphasis here, then we can have the discussion as to whether or not the legitimacy of a church or institution is based on something more foundational than its organizational structure. And that would be the position I would take.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I wonder, I definitely feel similarly. So, I mean, getting down to brass tacks, like who are the real Protestants? That's kind of what we're talking about. And who decides what real Protestantism is? Like, is it primarily a theological foundation that we would build upon this notion of Protestantism, or is it a historical, ecclesiological, institutional foundation, or can it be both? I don't know.
It could be both. Insofar as they coincide, I think historically and providentially, the way it played out, you have a strong theological foundation and basis for Reformation. And of course, that took place at a very specific time in history. And there were several movements within that broader movement. And so it does have that historical and even institutional aspect in terms of the instantiations of the Reformation. But I think if you take away the theological aspect of it, you're going to get a mere institutionalism. And then it's going to be very hard to decipher what is voluntary and what is involuntary departure. For example, maybe we would ask some questions. We would say, does Redeemed Zoomer consider it as a voluntary departure simply because a group, a faithful, biblically based and grounded group of saints decide to get up and launch a fresh mode of organization, a fresh institution, a fresh ecclesial community, as they call it. But they did that because the organization that they're a part of currently is utterly apostate. I mean, this is gonna, I think, push up against questions of what do we consider to be apostasy? How do we define apostasy? Is apostasy something that is merely individual, or can an institution as a whole go apostate? And then how do we determine whether or not that's happened quite yet? Is it
right?
So
right.
It does get pretty complex.
Right, and then which we can get back into the interview here in a second. But then the question: is it acceptable then to schism away from an apostate church for the purpose of maintaining doctrinal purity? So we'll get into that. As a quick note before we jump back in the interview, it seems to me that the correct label, instead of, because I don't want to just throw out, there's baby and bathwater here. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but the bathwater is, there really is a problem with evangelicals in America. I don't think it had anything to do with fear. I think it had to do a lot more with laziness. When they're talking about not fighting for these institutions, it was just going to take a lot of work. It was going to take a lot of effort. So I think there is something to be said for this habit of American evangelicals to give up on the institution and just start something new. So I think whenever I had RZ on my... Go ahead.
Let me push back just slightly on that. Not against you, but maybe against putting our whole argument, our whole analysis on that point of laziness. Because again, we're talking about voluntary and involuntary, and that is somewhat of a subjective determination. Just think about the fact that maybe we're not lazy. And maybe the fact that we're leaving to start a new institution is demonstrating that we have grit and we're ready to rebuild again. But the reason we're leaving, and maybe not fear, but what about wisdom? What about the fact that this church, this institution, is where a man is supposed to be raising his family. His children are going to be raised in this institution. And they've got a female pastor, and they're ordaining homosexuals, and they're doing all of these abominable things so that all of the preaching of the word is utterly corrupted to defend these false practices. Is this the place where a man before God believes that he needs to raise his family just because he doesn't want to let go of a particular institution?
Right.
So it's a prioritization here. And then when he does decide to depart, we have to ask that man, did you do that willingly and voluntarily, or did you feel that because of the degree of corruption, you yourself were forced out? In other words, the decision was made for you by virtue of the corruption that you can no longer tolerate because you are a steward over your own soul, okay, and the spiritual state of your own family. And you get enough men and enough families who decide that they're not going to be drinking the dirty water anymore. Maybe again, but so I'm pushing back just a little bit because I think there's a category there for the valiant. I think there's a category there for the courageous to go out where there's nothing for them. They're leaving something which is secure and stable and is for the most part functioning, and they're going out into a situation where they have to lay new foundations, they have to build from the ground up, they have to trust God through the whole thing, and they have to be cast out by even family, old church friends, and those who disagree with them and call them schismatics. It's not an easy thing. It takes a lot of grit. So I would just kind of, as long as we have that category as we go in our analysis, case by case, to say that there's that category on the table, along with some people doing it because they're just lazy, perhaps. Yeah, that could be valid too. Yeah,
and even that term, just lazy, probably doesn't fully encompass the reality. But I think you're right. You need to have these different categories. In my interview with him, on one of my interviews with RZ, that was my essential. That was my analysis of his Reconquista project. He seems to want everyone to get on board with Reconquista. And anyone who's not on board, it must be because they're a coward or something like that. And I don't think he would necessarily put it in so stark a terms, but whenever he communicates it, generally, that's how he comes across. And what I pushed back on was exactly what you were just saying, that, okay, well, not exactly. I was basically like, why shouldn't we have a both and? If there is a reality wherein these institutions have apostatized and, totally lost their credibility, why would you chastise people who are actually doing the hard work of building something new that is faithful, and mobilizing people to do this retaking and fighting for the institution? He definitely got me excited about the idea of retaking institutions, and I think there can be a wise and prudent way to go about that. But I think we can encourage people to do that and allow other people to, just in case we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, just in case it fails and God allows this institution that has become corrupted to just completely go by the wayside. Hey, look, we've got a backup that we're building. Yes, it doesn't have the financial backing and the history of that previous institution, but at least we got something, And so why would we discourage? Right. I think we can do a both and approach is kind of how I took it. But we can see where RZ goes from here.
Yeah. Hey, let me just give you a quick analogy, or at least a comparison. A lot of people have to wrestle with the question of whether or not they're going to get up and leave California. Okay, I've dealt with this because I'm a pastor in California, and here we're Church of the King, Sacramento. And so do you want to abandon this state, which is your fatherland, your homeland? This is your native born. You've got infrastructure, you've got roots, you've got family, maybe business. You've got a strong, thriving community. Yes. And some people are saying, well, why can't we just get up and leave? And I want to make it clear that we never, our people, our elders, our leadership, our sentiment over here is never that you can never get up and leave. There's a lot of good reasons for leaving and starting somewhere fresh, starting somewhere new. And so you can have a both and. And the way I've dealt with that in the past is I've said, you got to have some concrete points of criteria that you're using to determine that threshold, to determine when it's time to leave. Let's stay and fight. Let's stay and fight. Let's stay and build. Let's stay and do whatever we can. Reconquista. I love his movement. I think it's awesome. It's great. And I think more and more people should jump on that. But you got to have some points of concrete criteria that will determine when it's time for you to say, okay, it is thoroughly corrupt. This is no place for us. We had to come down with our points of criteria for staying and leaving California. I think the same thing is true with religious institutions in the Christian world.
And that's good. I don't know all the ins and outs of the Reconquista movement, but from my conversation with RZ, it seems that they have laid out some pretty helpful criteria in that he's not encouraging some people. This is what I thought. I thought he was just saying we all just need all us Presbyterians just need to join the local PCUSA church. Rainbow flags be damned. But no, he was saying no. I'm encouraging people to join one of the many conservative PCUSA churches that are still that are still actually conservative, and then basically infiltrating the denomination through the current faithful Orthodox conservative churches. And it's like, okay, that's helpful. Like, and if my church starts ordaining lady pastors and starts doing sparkle creeds, I'm out. Yeah, exactly. So let's see what else RZ has to say here.
Yeah.
Did you know that throwing a tomato at someone is an excellent way of getting their attention? Now that I have your attention, did you know that 60% of consumers will avoid your business if you have an odd or unattractive logo, even if your business has good reviews? Now, this podcast is sponsored by Resurrection Design Company, which helps kingdom-minded businesses and churches fix that problem with award-winning brand design. Right now, they're running a special for you, the listeners of this podcast. They are offering a free website design or redesign for the first 2 people who sign up for their brand identity package. This offer expires the last day of this month, so get out your phone right now and visit resurrectiondesign.com/Reformation to claim your free website design or redesign today. The link is in the description, and Resurrection Design has a 100% client satisfaction rate and 5 out of 5 stars on Google. Reformation Red Pill does not advise, nor do we condone literally throwing tomatoes at strangers in order to get their attention.
In 1 Timothy 4:8, the Apostle Paul tells us that physical training is indeed valuable for the Christian life. And while physical fitness is not the most important thing in the Christian life, it is still of great importance, particularly for men. Why? Because God has called you to protect and to provide. Men, you are called to be protectors. Therefore, God is calling you to be strong. Spiritually, emotionally, and yes, even physically. Physical fitness is also important because God has called you to provide. Your family needs you to live a long, healthy life. So, get strong and stay fit with Mount Athos. They are a Christian fitness company that uses some of the best natural ingredients. So I've personally been using their supplements for 6 months now, and I'll tell you right now, I am not going back. They are my new supplement brand. So, stop giving your money to pagan fitness brands that can't even tell the difference between men and women. Join Mount Athos in creating the next generation of health, strength, and spiritual vitality. Visit athosperform.com/Reformation. And don't forget to use code Reformation for an exclusive discount today.
Churches are fine. Like in Brazil, the mainline Presbyterian church there, very historic, got lots of beautiful cathedrals. Technically, Presbyterians don't have cathedrals, but they call them that for tax purposes. And it's mainline, it's historic, it's got a lot of universities, and it's very, very conservative. It's more conservative than the Catholic Church in Brazil. But in America, because of this radical individualism in American culture, the conservative Protestants chose to split off from the mainline denominations, and that's what let the mainline denominations drift so liberal.
Do you think part of that's also due to being a religious minority? Like when you're, for example, like in America, it was primarily founded on Protestant, ideals. Well, depending on how you define the Puritans, but
Puritans are Protestant.
Yeah. So Anglicans may not have thought that way about them, but so we'll get to all of that. Protestant foundation here, whereas in South America, it's more of a heavy Catholic influence. So the Protestants that are going to thrive there are going to be maybe more traditional and conservative. Similar, like I think, for example, you think about the decline of Protestantism in America. I think about the decline of Catholicism in Europe, for example, where especially where it was like just so big, but it turns into something where you rest on your laurels, kind of.
Right. I mean, to some extent, that's true. But there even are historically Protestant nations like Australia, where the mainline Protestant churches are mostly still conservative. Mm-hmm. The Presbyterian Church of Australia they actually had women's ordination and they got rid of it. There is this one liberal Protestant denomination in Australia called the Uniting Church, but it's sort of like the liberal minorities of all the other denominations who just sort of left and made their own thing. Mm-hmm. So Protestantism in America is completely cooked if we don't all return to the mainline churches. That's what
Real quick, I realize that it's good to lay your biases on the table. Not necessarily biases. Yeah, it's a biases. It's interesting because we are like we're exactly the kinds of people as CREC guys that he's talking about, in that we're a niche of a niche in many ways as a denomination. And it has a lot to do with what you've already talked about and what we've been talking about, that idea of doctrinal, ecclesiological purity that we're trying to aim at, liturgical purity. There's a lot of CREC distinctives that actually make it so wonderful that you can visit most any CREC church across the country and get basically know what you're getting in terms of the church culture. And that's a really powerful thing. But it also means that we achieve that precisely because we're like, schismatic is the wrong term, but because we started a new thing that, right. A relatively new denomination, the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. And and so putting that out there is to say, like, we're almost like the exact type of person that he's got his guns aimed at a little bit, his rhetorical guns aimed at.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and maybe you can say that we have a bias, but I don't think our bias is arbitrary. I think
everyone
does
to some degree.
We are that we're willing to defend that. I mean, look at some principles from Scripture, right? Look at the fact that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, right? It's already splitting apart, right? There's no neutrality, right? So Jesus gives this parable about when a king is being invaded by another army, he has to figure out whether he's going to be able to win this battle or not. If his soldiers, the amount of his soldiers, are going to be able to take the amount of the soldiers that are coming in from the other army. So there's a lot of wisdom that has to go into this, a lot of decision making throughout the whole thing. But I think if I can describe what these new institutional ventures really are, from my perspective, is they are consolidations of unity. And to me, that's very important. You just said, you can go to any CREC church across the world at this point, but across the entire denomination, okay? And you're going to know basically what the culture of that church is. And that's very important because we have unifying elements. And now imagine we get infiltrated by liberals, and all of a sudden we're battling. Now you've got some churches you can go into where you don't know what in the world you're going to get, and then you got other churches, and so you got these two factions, and maybe even a few more. There'll be a spectrum there. And what a new venture would do is it would take all of the churches that are of one mind, and they speak with one voice, and they stand shoulder to shoulder in the cultural battles and the doctrinal battles, and it consolidates. It's a reconsolidation of their unity. So that, what is an institution? It's just a mode of organization. That's all it is. So can we reorganize our people to continue on the work uninterrupted, unhindered, that would be more productive? Those are the questions we have to answer. And again, when you start getting down to the man and his household, it really becomes, is this even worth it to stay here and fight this battle? We have to count the cost, or is it better to direct our efforts into starting something new to reconsolidate unity, lay a stronger foundation, and keep going? And I would be in favor of that.
Yeah. Yeah. To even give like a concentrated summary of what you're talking about. Are you willing to sacrifice your children to take back an institution? And I think any good Christian man should say no. My children need to be discipled in as faithful a church body as I can find, and I'm not going to subject them to sparkle creeds and lesbian lady pastors just so that I could take the institution, if that makes sense. But I know that that's not what RZ is saying. We're just talking about
it's more nuanced.
Establishing
I appreciate
criteria.
Your comments from before that clarified his methodology in terms of taking over the conservative churches within the organization. Yeah, but again, there's got to be a threshold because we have to determine: are we going to win this battle? Yes or no? And if not, let's reconsolidate the unity that we have with like-minded churches, and let's continue on fighting in a consolidated way.
Yeah.
I want to really... Protestantism in America is completely cooked if we don't all return to the mainline churches. That's what I want to really communicate. So recently I did come back to Protestant apologist.
We didn't even touch that. Protestantism is cooked unless we all come back. And that seems to be his kind of controlling proposition that he really believes. And I think that's why he's so adamantly against and using such harsh language for those who would start new things rather than take the main lines. Because in his view, he believes that unless we do the hard work of retaking rather than the hard work of rebuilding, then Protestantism in America is cooked, as he says it. I fundamentally disagree with that. Yeah.
And this is probably the point that I'll disagree with most. And the reason why is that it seems to be based on an assumption. And don't get me wrong, institutions are important. Institutions create stability. Institutions centralize power and political power and cultural power and that sort of a thing. So it's not that institutions aren't important. However, if you go back to the early church and you just look at the Roman Empire as the institution, and you look at what the early church had, it had absolutely no political power whatsoever. The early Christian church didn't even have the right to vote. They were in an empire with an emperor, and it was an absolute totalitarian construct. So how was it then that they weren't cooked? How was it that the early church survived, and not only survived, but had a breakthrough, and then slowly started to grow and dominate and permeate and create for themselves an institutional presence in the world? It was through the hard work of suffering, being faithful to the gospel, prayer. I mean, trusting in God when you don't have institutional power.
Well,
Let me press
on that a little bit, because he might say in response to that, you're talking about, they were suffering for the sake of the gospel, but what we're talking about is schism, and the early church was unified. And to which I would say, I don't see evidence of that even in the New Testament. We have Judaizers coming in. We have even the apostles themselves, like, Peter getting rebuked to his face from Paul. Now, they came together in the Council of Jerusalem, and so there definitely was a unity, but it seems like there was constantly conflict and potential. I guess it really depends on how strictly you would define schism, I guess. He would say perhaps that they were able to make this progress because they maintained institutional unity or something like that. And I don't know if there's enough historical evidence to support that. That seems more like an Eastern Orthodox kind of claim. I think Protestants, we are typically a lot more comfortable with the kind of the almost the erratic nature of the early church, the Holy Spirit coming in power and really, empowering the early church, not in a papal Roman EO kind of sense, that had everything directly, like kind of call it like apostolic succession style. But there was a little bit more, not chaos, but organized chaos, maybe organized from on high. Anyway, that's not necessarily neither here nor there. I was just thinking how he might respond to that.
Sure. And I think that's fair to anticipate a reasonable response on his part. Again, it comes down to, I think, the idea of at what point is the institution of such a nature that it cannot be departed from when it goes corrupt. I mean, yes, the church from the very beginning was institutional, but what is the foundation of the institution? Is it merely its form of organization, or is it doctrinal fidelity, theological fidelity? Is it worship? Pure worship. See, if we were to look at this from a reformational standpoint, we could ask the question, what constitutes a true church? And in fact, maybe right now, I'll just give you a quick reading from the Belgic Confession, just because I think it should be said that the reformational perspective on this is very clear. Now, the Lutheran churches, when they ask what is a true church, seem to indicate that there are two marks: the pure preaching of the gospel and the right administration of the sacraments. The Reformed also brought in the faithful exercise of church discipline. Let me read this section from the Belgic Confession of Faith, Article 29. It says, the marks by which the true church is known are these: if the pure doctrine of the gospel is preached therein, if it maintains the pure administration of the sacraments as instituted by Christ, if church discipline is exercised in chastening of sin. In short, if all things are managed according to the pure word of God, all things contrary thereto rejected, and Jesus Christ, get this one, is acknowledged as the only head of the church. Hereby the true church may certainly be known, from which no man has a right to separate himself. And then real quick, this last section at the bottom of Article 29, it talks about how you can see what the false church does. And I won't read the whole section, but what the false church eventually does is it persecutes those who live holily according to the word of God and rebuke it for its errors, covetousness, and idolatry. These two churches are easily known and distinguished from each other. So one of the marks of a false church is that it persecutes the righteous, because the righteous are protesting against the abuses that are in it. And the abuses here are the errors, covetousness, and idolatry.
Well, it seems to me then that these liberal PCUSA churches are exactly that, right? False churches, and so at what point? So I guess the question then becomes, at what point does this congregation of false church, this presbytery, this congregation of false churches, when does that signal that the entire institution itself is corrupt? Because so when is it that you've got enough gangrene that the whole arm has to go? At what point do we actually make that call? And I'm not saying that that is necessarily where it is right now. I am in favor of the both and approach to the Reconquista movement, but it seems that he wants to say the true church is one that has its historical roots to the magisterial Protestant Reformation, whereas that is in contradiction to what the Belgic Confession is saying, which is that the true church is actually, and you just laid it out for us right there, not just,
Let me jump in there, because there is an analogy to the argument for apostolic succession. So I'm not saying that this is what RZ is doing or saying, but there's some similarities here, because what he's doing is he's tracing a genealogy, if you will, of institutions, this institution. Whereas, Roman Catholicism has long argued that what makes a valid church is the succession, as apostolic succession. Now, the Lutherans and the Reformed originally argued against the idea that what validates the church is a succession of persons and offices. But instead, they said that what makes a valid church is a succession that is continuity, a succession of sound apostolic doctrine. So there's two different forms historically of apostolic succession. One of them of persons and offices, and the other of doctrine. So that a true church is identified by it being the successor of the true apostolic theology as we find in God's word. And let me, if I could, just show you how that I do a lot of work in Roman Catholic apologetics, but I'll make the connection here in just a minute. Let me read from Tertullian, a quick quote, and then I have one from Epiphanius. So Tertullian on the prescription against heretics, this is what he says. Even if heretics fabricate such a succession of bishops, their very doctrine, when compared with apostolic doctrine, will declare from its diversity and quantity that it does not belong to any apostle as its author, nor to any apostolic man. This is because, just as the apostles did not teach different things among themselves, so also apostolic men do not publish writings contrary to the apostles, except those people who revolt from the apostles and preach in a different manner. That is an apostolic succession of doctrine where theology is the thing, truth is the thing, and not necessarily just the handing down of a particular office. One more quote from Epiphanius of Salamis, and this is in his medicine chest writing, and it's just a single sentence. He says, "The succession of doctrine is to be sought, not the succession of persons." Okay. I bring all that up because there seems to be some connection between these two modes of argumentation in terms of establishing validity and legitimacy. Is it really just a matter of we need to get back to those original institutions, as if the institution gives the body legitimacy?
Right.
I would say that a magisterial reformed or reformers position puts a lot more emphasis on continuity of doctrine and theology than it does. And we even see this in the scriptures. If we wanted to develop that more, I'll not give more now, but we could make that case, I think, from the scriptures to some extent. But again, that would be going into apostolic succession, whereas RZ is talking about institutional historicity. So,
well, it definitely is related, right? Because we're trying to decide who we're trying to figure out who gets to decide who the real Protestants are. If he's trying to, like we said, create this new taxonomy that excludes evangelicals from Protestantism, precisely because they don't have historical ties to one of the several mainline denominations.
Yeah, they left the institution.
Yeah, exactly. So what you're talking about is really important because it's not just that's not a rabbit trail. It's quite relevant to the discussion because we're trying to figure out who gets to decide what a true church is, who gets to decide who is legitimate. And so I think that there is it seems to me an overemphasis on historical continuity with institutions. Coming from someone who is very friendly to the Reformed tradition and the CREC in general, we try to tie ourselves very strongly to the historic tradition of the Reformed faith. But I do think you can go too far in your insistence upon historical continuity with these institutions, and end up sacrificing something that's very, very important, which is, like all the quotes that you were just reading, that legitimacy doesn't come, like you read the Belgic and you read these church fathers, and they make it very clear that the legitimacy is not coming from office. It's not coming from a necessary historical continuity with a tradition. It's coming from the Word of God itself and right doctrine preached, right church discipline, and sacraments. Rightly. Good grief, my words are not coming. I got a button for that over here. See, that's. No, but the true church comes about, not through succession of, whether it's historical continuity or apostolic succession. Not merely, but rather through the right preaching, right administration of the sacraments.
If you have to pick one, we're going to go with theology and doctrine because forming a new institution and reorganizing a group of faithful churches is the launching of a program that seeks to go back to the truth. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the mission, that's where its legitimacy is. It goes back to where the departures took place. And the departures could be doctrinal and theological. They could also be moral and ethical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about how the Apostle Paul advises the people in Corinth on how they are to interact with each other. Again, we could go the biblical route. We could develop a biblical case about what are some of the grounds for separating from your brethren. And then 2 Corinthians 6, how can two walk together if they're not agreed? And God calls the faithful to come out of whatever the present organization happened to be. So we could probably make a 70 AD case that was the Old Testament structure, and maybe there's some validity to that. But as a paradigm, as something that we could draw practical principles of application for the future, I think there's still something to be said there.
That's good. That's good. Well, let's jump back in and see where he lands this plane here.
Apologetics, and that's why I responded to like your video.
Yeah, sure.
But I'm specifically a mainline Protestant apologist. What I'm defending is not this category of Protestantism that includes non-denominational churches or Jehovah's Witness or Calvary Chapel or even the PCA. I'm defending mainline
the
Protestant.
Presbyterian Church of America.
Yeah, that's the schismatic conservative group that left in the 1970s because they didn't like that the Presbyterian Church supported civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
I know that that's true because they've publicly repented of that, but that's still why they exist.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to break the terms down here because I think I look at Protestantism. I have a different categorical framework. Yours seems to be more institutional based, just to understand who is a Protestant. It seems like your definition is more of a historical institutional continuity versus doctrine or methods.
I mean, basically, yeah.
There it is.
Like, if I am some random guy in my basement and I decide that I agree with transubstantiation and purgatory, does that make me a Catholic? No, I have to actually join the Catholic Church. So I think you're comparing apples and oranges if you compare the institution of Catholicism to the vague idea of Protestantism based on the 5 solas, which didn't exist until the 20th century.
Okay.
I define Protestantism the same way you define Catholicism or Orthodoxy. It's an institution. A Protestant is someone who's part of a Protestant church, and a Protestant church is a church with roots in the Reformation.
And so even right there, what does it mean to have roots in the Reformation? Does the CREC have roots in the Reformation? I would say absolutely and obviously. But he's going to want to say no because we're a relatively new denomination.
Right. I think Trent was very insightful. I think I was tracking with what RZ was saying, and so was Trent. And Trent was saying, okay, here's your taxonomy. Your taxonomy is institutional and not doctrinal. And RZ said basically, yeah. And I would say that, again, can we have the best of both worlds when it can exist? Sure. But if you've got to choose one of them to say, herein lies the legitimate Protestant church, the legitimate Christian church for that, the legitimate Catholic church for that, you got to go with doctrine. You got to go with theology. You have to go with morals. You have to go with ethics because we really are talking about the question of whether or not an institution can go apostate.
Right.
Is it just individuals who go apostate, or can an institution go apostate?
Right. Right.
What if somebody said, well, I'm an evangelical and their roots are the Anabaptists who were present at the Reformation, so why can't I be considered a Protestant?
So if you consider the radical Reformation part of the Reformation, maybe there is some ambiguity in these terms, but there was a very clear distinction between the magisterial Reformation, which was institutional, and the radical Reformation, which was anti-institutional. And the magisterial reformers, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and Knox, they saw themselves as having much more unity with the Catholics than with the radical Reformation. So if you want to just use the Protestant label because you have some Anabaptist heritage, that's fine, but then you can't claim Luther and Calvin as your boys the way a lot of these guys want to do.
This is an important point, and when I first was looking over this interview, what stood out to me, and forgive us if we are repeating ourselves, I think we're perhaps reiterating some of these points as they come up in the interview, but the idea that Luther and Calvin were closer to the Catholics than they were to the Anabaptists, it's definitely true in one sense, but it's also, I would say, it's also not true in another important sense. And this is getting back to the importance or this this kind of push and pull, this tug of war between what's truly more foundational. Is it institutional credibility or is it theology? Because the whole purpose of the Protestant Reformation, or at least one of the primary doctrines, was the doctrine of salvation, of soteriology. And that there's a reason why the Reformation, why they completely ended up reforming away from the Catholic Church, was because this doctrine, the doctrine of like the five solas, this doctrine of soteriology, was so foundational to the Christian church that it was worth doing what they saw as a radical move. The Reformation is radical. Like you've got this church that's been gaining institutional power, that's built Christendom, and then all of a sudden, because of the corruption that you've seen, of course, it wasn't just that. There was a lot of other things that they were correcting and writing about and addressing in the Reformation. But yes, Calvin and Luther were closer to Roman Catholics on a whole range of issues, sure. But when it comes to one of the most foundational aspects of the Christian faith, they weren't. And they saw it as important enough that they were going to, start a whole new Protestantism,
Well, a couple of things I would like to say here, just to do some spade work, a little bit of fine tuning here, if I can trace out some of the assumptions underneath, and that is that, first of all, let me grant RZ. I would tend to agree with him that Luther was a lot, and Calvin was a lot closer to Roman Catholicism than they were with the fringe Reformation groups like the Anabaptists. And that's for a lot of reasons. Yes, he mentions one reason. He mentions one that basically is, well, they were anti-institutional. But okay, fine, that's one. But there's a lot of reasons why the Reformers were not so friendly with the Anabaptists, okay? First of all, what about rebaptizing? Second of all, they were not just anti-institutional for the church, but they were anti-institutional for the state. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about those who wanted to tear down society as a whole.
Right.
You're talking about some groups claiming to have a continuation of the inspiration of, the Holy Spirit giving prophecies. They were very, Pentecostal before Pentecostalism came in the 20th century. They were communist. The Anabaptists were not big on private property. So go figure. Down with the state, but in with what? Reallocation of, redistribution of personal property.
There was a lot of reasons.
And that's not even. Yeah. And that's not even to even exhaust the list of all the doctrinal aberrations. So yeah, okay, let's grant that. Let's grant the fact that the Reformers were a lot closer to Roman Catholicism than these fringe radical groups like the Anabaptist groups. That's true. But I think what he's doing is he's choosing one because he wants to emphasize the institution. I would also say that probably somewhere underneath, because it sounded like, and I don't want to make you go back, but it sounded like Trent suggested it and RZ just kind of let it go. And that is that modern evangelicals trace their roots to the Anabaptists. Okay, we've got to do some spade work there to see if we could really trace those roots in that direct way. When he's talking about evangelicals, is he considering Reformed Baptist evangelicals in his sense of the term? That they trace their roots back to the Anabaptists, and then the question is, how similar are Reformed Baptists to the Anabaptists? Who are their real, theological ancestors, predecessors? So I think there's a lot of more fine tuning. I think there's a lot more nuance we have to have in the discussion. But sometimes, it's an interview and they're going back and forth, and you got to be fair because both of their minds are going, and then they jump on certain things. But I just wanted to pause here and say a little more spade work there would be good. And let me just say now, because RZ did say it, we are identifying evangelical in this interview as something that is not Protestant. Mm-hmm. And I don't think historically that's even the way the term was used. I mean, Luther referred to himself and all the churches that were of the same mind as the evangelical churches. Why? Because they stood for the truth of the gospel over and against the claims and doctrines and practices of Roman Catholicism. They were the evangelical churches. So they were one thing. And I think that usage, that historical usage, is very important. So I would just say, and that lasted for centuries, okay? That lasted for centuries. Eventually, you do have, a pietistic group growing up within Lutheranism that also referred to itself as evangelicals. But now we could say this, just as RZ wants to fight for those original institutions, why don't we also fight for the original terminology, like evangelical? I'm proud to be an evangelical when we understand its historic sense, right? So we are
yeah, even in the modern sense, really, from what I understand, evangelical, the term evangelical really gained steam, particularly in the debates between conservative Christianity and liberalizing Christianity of the last century, right? And so the evangelicals were the ones who held the line on a whole number of theological issues, whether it's inerrancy, infallibility, all these highly important doctrines.
There was a sense in which at some point, and I think this is in recent memory, where a lot of people are starting to attach the word evangelical to fundamentalism, and that was a movement. But again, this is a progression, a historical progression, and I'd be willing to fight for the original meaning of evangelical, which means and then here you go again, gospel centered. What is this gospel centered? Well, it depends who's using the term, but really it was those original reformers who said we have to get back to the gospel, we have to recover the gospel, the truth of God's word, the truth of Scripture. Those were the evangelical Christians. Those were the evangelical churches. I think and we are. I was going to say earlier, we are the CREC. We are the Communion of Reformed Evangelical churches, and I'm proud to refer to myself as an evangelical. In fact, I even see this term still being used in its proper sense. I was watching a video not too long ago from Brian Wolfmueller. He is a Lutheran pastor, I think in the LCMS. And he refers to himself as an evangelical Catholic. Okay, so I mean, so again, someone could charge RZ with some level of arbitrarity, right? So he's being arbitrary in terms of how is he defining voluntary and involuntary departure? What's necessary? What's not necessary? Those are good questions. And then also his taxonomy is grabbing historic terms and relegating those to maybe their most recent abuses. And I would say, is that arbitrary? Should we not go back to what this originally meant and so forth? So on a bunch of different levels, I think he is to be commended. But I think there remains some outstanding questions that need more clarification.
And I bet you he'd be willing to come on and talk about it sometime. Maybe we can all do a fun discussion about some of this. Do you have time to go a little bit further, or do we need to land the plane?
Sure, if you want to.
Yeah, we got a little bit longer here.
Right. Because I think that when I'm trying to put everyone in here, like, what are the consequences of your view? So I guess there are Protestants. Would it be easier if we just said there's Catholic, Orthodox, Protestants, and Evangelicals?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I basically say.
Okay. So for example, like, would you say I think it's fair to name names here to see where people fall.
Yeah.
Like, would you consider like Gavin Ortland a Protestant or an evangelical?
So he's an interesting case because he actually was part of one of the 7 mainline Protestant denominations, the American Baptist Church USA.
Yeah.
And now he's part of a non-denominational church. And I have publicly voiced my disagreement with him. I have the utmost respect for Gavin Ortland. He's great. I do disagree with him on the validity of evangelicalism, though. So I think he definitely has a lot of Protestant roots.
Well, his view of the Eucharist seems almost close to the Presbyterian spiritual presence view.
It is. And there are some Baptists with roots in the Reformation. It's just a very small group of them. Yeah. Like the American Baptist Churches USA are descended from like the 1689 particular Baptists. They founded Brown University. They founded Rhode Island. They have a lot of Protestant heritage. The vast majority of Baptists you encounter today have no historical connection to that and are just non-denominationals with a Baptist label.
Right. Then moving on, though, so I guess would you say like John MacArthur and William Lane Craig not only are evangelicals, I feel like you'd probably want to label them heretics.
Yes, they are not Protestants. They're heretics. They're not even like, you don't have to be a heretic to be an evangelical. Because John Piper, for example, is an evangelical, but he confesses that Mary is the Theotokos.
Right.
Unlike John MacArthur, who said Mary did not give birth to God. God was never born.
Yeah, or Jesus' blood isn't God's blood.
Yeah, he is way more Nestorian than Nestorius.
Yeah.
Nestorius said it's more accurate to call Mary the mother of Christ than mother of God. Not Mary is not mother of God.
Okay. So you're trying to...
So something that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot interesting there. There's a bunch of people will...
I have to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
According to RZ, is Trent Horn a heretic?
I would assume so.
Yeah, right. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm not going to argue with RZ. I'm not going to defend John MacArthur and his views on those particular points. But I will say this: there is a growing sentiment, and this is pastoral. This is CREC focused. There is a sense in which the CREC wants to express a high level of Catholicity. But from my understanding, it is a Reformed Catholicity. It is a Reformation Catholicity in the sense that we recognize that our identity is very much reformational. And we're not afraid to do some retrieval work and pull out from, medieval times and early church times, patristic times, good solid content with which we have agreement and continuity, but that we are not going to bypass the Reformation or undo the Reformation or somehow denigrate the good work of the Reformation. So as the CREC, but what I do notice is that some of our, I don't want to say some of our people, but maybe a sentiment that I can sense growing is this idea of saying, well, what Catholicity should mean for us is that Roman Catholics are just as much our brothers as a Reformed Baptist. Now, I'm not talking about salvation, but I am talking about, legitimacy of institutions, legitimacy. And if we're talking theologically and doctrinally about the legitimacy, that can create some real tension. It can create some real problems. For instance, if a church wants to join the CREC, or someone wants to join the CREC, and that particular church has to choose, they have to affirm all the Catholic creeds, which is true. We fight for that, but they also have to choose one or more Reformation confessions. Okay, Reformation era confessions, and among the list, on that list is the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. So, where the CREC stands is that we allow Reformed Baptist churches, theoretically, to join the CREC, saying that we are able to have communion with them. But we don't allow a church to join, and I know this would never happen, but this is a good point. We don't allow churches to join if they subscribe to the Council of Trent. Okay, if they subscribe to Vatican I or Vatican II. Okay, so when we talk about where we stand in terms of the spectrum of communion, we are very much more aligned with Reformed Baptists than we are with Roman Catholics. And I think, and I'm only saying this because there's a growing sentiment to this idea that we should just equalize it all. And I just don't think we should equalize it all. I think that where we have come to as the CREC is a good, healthy place because we recognize that the Reformation is critical to the purity of the Christian church. And so here, you have an interview and you're not going to offend your host. He's being nice to Trent. Trent's a great guy. He's a nice guy. But people will walk away from this saying RZ and Trent, man, they just had this buddy, brother kind of conversation and spent quite a bit of time, talking about the evangelicals and how these guys are schismatic and they're heretics in some cases, and even some of the Baptist ministers like John MacArthur as being heretics, not hesitating to cast him out as such. And I just think to myself, a little bit of perspective here. The man he's talking to, I hope he'd be willing to say, is also a heretic. And if we're gonna say what's worse, denying a technical theological term that was very controversial, Theotokos, the God bearer, simply because of a fear of deifying Mary, okay? Or imbibing, teaching, believing, practicing the official Roman Catholic doctrine, dogma, and practices. Which one is more of a danger here? So
Yeah.
just want to register that. You know?
That's a really great point. And I think that's very well taken, hopefully in our audience, because that chasm on the papish side is much wider than that chasm on the John MacArthur side.
I think it should be. I'd rather be a Baptist than a Romanist.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's finish this up and land the plane. Proverbs 13:22 tells us that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Well, if you're anything like me, you want to be a good, godly man, a man who provides for his family, a man who wisely stewards the financial resources that God has given him. And man, is that hard to do in today's economy. Now, I have personally spoken with multiple financial advisors, and I want you guys to know that I am personally using Joe Garrisi and his team at Backwards Planning Financial. Maybe you thought like I have. I wish that I had started investing years ago for my family's financial future. Maybe then me and my family would be in a better financial position. Listen, it's never too late to start. Joe Garrisi with Backwards Planning Financial works hard to help families achieve their financial goals. He's a Christian who works with one of the largest and most trusted financial service companies in the world. Whether you have millions in assets or you're just now getting started investing, Joe Garrisi can help you reach your financial goals. Visit backwardsplanningfinancial.com or call Joe Garrisi at 615-767-2555. Men, we are called to be providers and protectors. And part of being a protector means being prepared to defend our families, to defend our nation, to defend our rights. Which brings me to our sponsor, Armored Republic. Armored Republic exists to honor Christ by providing free men with the tools of liberty to defend their God-given rights. Body armor is a tool of liberty. So, equip yourself to resist tyrants and criminals at armoredrepublic.com.
Defend Protestantism, and you think, okay, if we're going to make apples to apples comparison, like you're going to compare the institutional Catholic Church with its doctrines and methods, the comparison must be then to an institutional Protestant framework, which might include then confessional Lutherans, Presbyterians, Anglicans, I guess. But we have to cut off, for example, like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, or they have therefore same-sex marriage and like female pastors, or do you?
I don't think we have to cut them off because just because the German Catholic bishops are teaching a lot of heterodoxy, it doesn't mean we say they're not Catholic. We say they're Catholics in rebellion against Catholic teaching.
Well, they're not doing same-sex weddings.
That's true. But I would still there are Arian bishops in the Catholic Church in the 300s, and they're still technically Catholic bishops and stuff. They're just Catholic bishops that are heretical.
So I guess
they're part of the institution.
So you'd have a preference then for let's say like a mainline church that has these liberal views and female pastors versus, let's just say, a really conservative evangelical church that's straight down the line on abortion, same-sex marriage, male pastors only. Seems like you have a preference for the more liberal mainline one. Am I hearing this right?
Yes, and that's kind of why I'm doing the Reconquista, because all the mainline denominations are liberalized to the same extent that the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, is.
You just think they can be fixed?
Yes, because Athanasius didn't split off voluntarily and start Athanasius' Free Bible Church in the desert when the majority of the church was hijacked by heretics in the 300s. Mm-hmm. Both Catholics and Protestants agree it's possible for the majority of the church at a particular time, at least the institution of the church, to be hijacked by this or that heresy.
Right.
But that does not in and of itself warrant schisming. And by the way, the Reformers and the Presbyterian Scholastics agree with this.
Right.
Robert Bailey is one of the four main, Scottish Presbyterian authors of the Westminster Confession. So he's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And he says that even if your church gets taken over by heretics, that is not a valid reason to schism. He said in 1 Corinthians, they were blaspheming the Eucharist, and in Galatians, they were preaching a false gospel. And his exact words are, "Yet from none of these churches did any of the apostles ever separate, nor gave they the least warrant to any of their disciples to make a separation from any of them." Mm-hmm. Samuel Rutherford has a very detailed system for when it's okay to separate versus when it's not. And basically, it's if you're excommunicated, then it's an existential decision. you have to ask, was that excommunication valid? And in 99 out of 100 cases, it is. But the Protestant belief is that the excommunication of the reformers was not valid.
Okay.
And the reason I'm not Catholic, because everyone's like, oh, if you want to retake the mainline churches, why not retake the Catholic Church and make it Protestant? Because I respect the Catholic Church. I respect that they've anathematized Protestant views. I'm not going to try and sneak into the Catholic Church and lie about what I believe and try to subvert it.
Right.
Like if somehow the Catholic Church was able to tolerate Protestant views, I know most of the mainline Protestant churches would be happy to go into full communion with the Catholic Church. But I'm sure that you don't support that happening. I don't think you want the Catholic Church to just take back what they said about Protestant theology.
Well, I think that we can.
There was a lot there.
Yeah.
So and it seems that he is here. He's offering his threshold, right? That we were talking about before. He's offering his threshold
for excommunication.
Formal excommunication that is not valid, and that is the only situation wherein one is permitted to start something new. Essentially, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would say, I think it's great that he clarified that, and so I understand. And I had a feeling that's where he was going, but again, it just brings up the question for myself: is that the only reason to depart from an apostate institution, or an institution that's going apostate, that is so thoroughly corrupt? Is it only when you finally become formally excommunicated? That's his position. He'll have to make a case for it. But I would still go back to this question, and I would tend to lean in a different direction to say, just as an individual can go apostate, so can an institution, and those that are within it need to come out. So let me read to you from 1 Corinthians 5. And this is an individual basis, on an individual basis, but I would say, I would leave us with the question. Paul says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named as a brother who is sexually immoral, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. So yes, I understand that perhaps someone could take Paul's statement here and he can say, well, he's just talking about eating with them in your home and keeping company with them in your home. But the Lord's table, the Lord's supper, the communion meal, does that have no bearing upon the principles that Paul's giving here? Is that not a legitimate application of what Paul is saying, that when you have people who are steeped in idolatry, okay, idolatry is one of this, and sexually immoral, the question is, how can we have communion? How can we eat with them? And for us to I don't know. I want to go easy, because I mean, I want to give him a chance to just demolish me back. Maybe I'm making too many assumptions, but on the surface of it, I would say just the fact that I'm in this local congregation and these guys are in this local congregation, as if that there's no communion, there's no unity, I think undermines his basic point. Because if there is some validity in an institutional connection, well then that comes with its own implications as to what else are we doing when we have an institutional connection. If the institutional connection validates us as being part of a legitimate church, then what else does it do in terms of asking the question, are we communing with one another?
And that is a great point. That's a great point. I have a different passage that I was going to read, but that does a great job of highlighting actual, Pauline apostolic teaching that forbids you from communing with idolaters, sexually immoral. The other question I had that came up whenever he kind of laid out his criteria for why it is, or when it is permissible to finally leave a church and start a new work, that and he laid it out as you've got to be wrongly excommunicated. Well, what about an apostate church that is so apostate that it literally doesn't even excommunicate people anymore? Like, it has no sense of church discipline. Yeah, they don't do that. They don't practice that anymore. So at what point does a church lose its legitimacy? Because if you can openly advocate for homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion, all of these abominable acts, and not only can a member openly advocate for and participate in those things, but the ministers themselves can do that. Well, you're sure not going to get excommunicated for that. You might get excommunicated for being too faithful to the scriptures, maybe. And I guess that's the situation maybe he would point back to. That's the whole point of Luther, right? Being excommunicated for being too faithful to the scriptures. But what about the church that doesn't even do that? That they just don't care. That there's no sense of guarding the table. There's no sense of true membership anymore. And are you just stuck because they won't excommunicate you? I don't know. To me, that seems like that's. I think there's several weak points, holes that we've kind of poked in some of this. I think that's another one.
Yeah.
But the scripture. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, just piggybacking off of that, why would the excommunication be valid? Like, should we even recognize it?
I guess he would say no. That's the point. Is that, well, I don't know. That's it. Honestly, this is where it gets really fuzzy, because he's trying to set this criteria. He's trying to make this threshold, but the threshold itself is so wrought with kind of.
Look, if the institution itself and not the people who are in it, so these wicked people are in it, the institution itself has its own legitimacy for legitimacy's sake, for the institution's sake, then it operates objectively very different from how these wicked men want to operate it. In other words, a car drives the way a car drives, and you don't get to get in and determine how it drives. Like, it doesn't fly. So if we're really putting all this stock into the validity of a church and my membership and my standing with God and who I am in history and all of my identity into an objective legitimacy of the institution, well, then there are objectively right ways that it functions. And when these men try to wield it against its own nature and try to say you're excommunicated, are they really doing that validly and objectively? I mean, that's another question. You could say you don't have the authority because this institution is valid, and therefore the truth remains with the institution. So that would be an invalid excommunication.
Yeah. When the Sparkle Creed priestess says you're excommunicated, I say, no, you're excommunicated. Who gets to decide here? Yeah, you do not represent the church in any way. So yeah.
But I do think when the official doctrine of the church has changed, the institution, so it's codified. You're talking about Council of Trent. You're talking about Vatican I. You're talking about anathematizing the gospel. Okay, from my perspective, that means the institution itself has gone apostate. From a Reformation perspective, you're sitting there. Calvin really wrestled with this in Book 4. Calvin was really wrestling back and forth. He wanted to refer to the Roman church as a true church in some sense, but he recognized it was so thoroughly corrupt that he goes back and forth between, in what sense can we say that some glimmering, some residue of legitimacy still abides there. And then, but he constantly goes back to this idea, it basically is a church in name only. And at the end, he says, it cannot truly be called a legitimate church. And that's because the institution itself has anathematized the gospel and persecuted those who stood for the gospel and against idolatry.
That's good. Well, I think we've been chewing on a lot here. And honestly, my hope and prayer for this episode was to kind of address, I know a lot of people follow Redeemed Zoomer, and like I said, I like him personally, and we've had some great interactions. He's been on the show. A lot of people in my audience, they I guess they don't like that I like him because he's not based enough or something like that. But honestly, he's super sharp. He's a relatively new believer. I think he does have some views that, I mean, even outside of this, that I am definitely in strong disagreement with. He recently talked about how there can be legitimate female pastors, but I like the guy, and I don't know. I'm a little bit more charitable with someone like Redeemed Zoomer because I guess I see myself in him. I see him. He's on a doctrinal journey, and he is doing it all in public, in a very public setting with his very successful YouTube channel. And I think that's a lot of people's critique is like, hey, stop teaching people. You need to learn for a bit. I don't know. I get that. And I do see some doctrinal issues that have been coming up. But also, man, he's doing a really cool work that is much needed. And so, like, I wish him and his Reconquista movement well. I pray that the PCUSA gets retaken for the kingdom of Christ. I do pray that. I hope and pray that. And I would encourage people, who are in their town, there's no CREC churches, there's no faithful conservative churches. Oh wait, here is a conservative PCUSA church. I could join the Reconquista movement and be a part of retaking that denomination. I would totally encourage that. That's great. But I wouldn't encourage anyone to go sit under a female pastor with, lesbian Sparkle Creed ladies. I would, in no world would I recommend that. And so, with RZ, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I like him, and I would love to even have him on if he would want to come back on to discuss some of this stuff. I would be interested to see a debate or a discussion on the proposition the CREC churches are legitimate Protestant churches. I wonder, and it'd be an interesting discussion. I might pose that to him and just see if he's interested in coming on for that. But any last words, Pastor Paul, if you can kind of wrap things up for us?
I think just reiterating what you're saying, I think we need to commend RZ. He's a young man. He's doing a good work. It's commendable. I mean, there's nothing to critique in any kind of a harsh way. Those of us who've been around a little longer can look at him and say, okay, we're watching his development. But the fact that he's out there, I think Doug Wilson had a saying that I really thought was cool, where he says, I like his way of doing it better than your way of not doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that applies here. I mean, look at us. What are we doing? We jump on this video and we say, hey, wait a second, that generates some questions. Let's have some discussion. So we jump on here and we start kind of working through it a little bit, asking questions, and maybe some of my questions can be answered. Maybe RZ will come back and say, well, you got this wrong and you got that wrong. And so I think charity at the end of the day is what's going to keep us having a good and profitable and fruitful conversation. But the last thing I'll say is I really want to make sure that your viewers, especially Joshua, are grounded in their Reformation identity. I think that's something that we should never let go of. We need to go back and read the Reformers. We need to understand Calvin, understand Luther. I think the more we do that, the more some of these other issues about succession and legitimacy and validity are going to become clear. They're going to become clear. And I would just urge your listeners to get back. So often we say, we're stuck in the 16th century. Well, guess what? If you lose the 16th century, you're losing a lot. So don't lose the 16th and 17th century. Add that and use it as a filter through which you're hearing a lot of the things coming at you today, because there's a rich theological and ecclesiological history that we have ourselves.
Yeah, we have the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of giants and not remake the wheel, which to RZ's credit, he is pointing out a real problem in evangelicalism, that it's just reinventing the wheel instead of going back to stand on the shoulders of the giants in the faith that went before us. So I think you're absolutely right on that. And I'll end with this scripture to kind of finally put the point on our case. 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness. A lot of times we think of this passage applying exclusively to marriage, but I think this kind of reinforces the scripture that you brought up earlier, talking about the fact that we are not to even sit down and eat with those who would be sexually immoral and idolaters who also claim the name of Christ, which seems to legitimize the idea that there is a time, as this passage says, what fellowship has light to do with darkness? Like when it comes to institutions that have gone dark, okay, we are the light of the world, and we are not to have fellowship with the darkness. And so that's the last kind of final passage that I'd put out there. And I'd be interested to hear what RZ has to say kind of in response to the passage you brought up and this one as well. So I guess that does it for us today. And Pastor Paul and I are gonna discuss something in the backstage. Last time we talked about baptismal regeneration, which was super fun. So that was an episode that's now up on in our backstage on the Discord. But I think we may stick on some of that baptismal regeneration, and we've got a couple other baptism questions that some of our people have had. We've also got some questions about FV. So I know we don't have all day, but we might open up a can of worms in the backstage. So if you guys want to come see that, you got to join the club.
Not a can of worms, but a can of oatmeal stout.
Yeah, a can of oatmeal stout. That's that good stuff. That's right. Okay, well, with that, you guys come join the club and watch along. We have some great dialogue about this stuff. My hope and prayer, as you guys well know, is that everything that we do here at The Forge, here at Reformation Red Pill, all the resources we create would be tools to better equip you to build, defend, and expand the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we'll see you guys on the next episode.